On today's show, who are the Houston Rockets' star trade options? How much is too much to give up in a trade to improve the roster right now? Ranking available star players and more. It's all coming up right here at Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Thursdays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets, where the best way you can help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Just head on over to FanDuel.com. And as always, thanks so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you so much for being an everydayer. And joining us now is your weekly co-host, none other than the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose, who you can track down on Blue Sky at Ben DuBose. Here's where we're going to kind of dive into this ongoing conversation. This is going to be a topic all offseason long, it feels like, until the Rockets maybe make a substantial move of some kind. But the idea that this Rockets team is in a pretty solid position to make kind of maybe not like a full-blown all-in type move, but to at least, maybe push some of their chips to the center of the table and make a play for a star caliber piece to add to an already 52-win team from this past season. And Ben, there's been so much, so many rumors, so much speculation. It feels like the Rockets are constantly involved in these, trade rumors and stuff with guys, centered around like Giannis and then Kevin Durant and Devin Booker and all these different names that are floating around out there. We know from Rafael Stone's kind of exit interviews that he did with media and then with Vanessa Richardson, right? Continuity versus, chasing a star player has been a topic of discussion quite a bit. Where do you stand in regards to looking at this Rockets team, looking at what they achieved this past season, and whether or not you feel confident in them just kind of running it back essentially versus having to, add a little bit more to this group, this offseason?
I will say, I'm leaning a little more towards continuity now than I was coming off the Warriors series. I think the more time that passes, and also seeing how the Western Conference has looked since then, to me, Jackson, it feels like OKC is in a tier by itself. And I think all season long, we should have thought that. There might have been a fleeting moment here or there, especially when the Nuggets pushed them a bit in round 2 that we thought otherwise. But I think what we're seeing now is there's a reason why they won almost 70 games and look so dominant. And really, all the way from 2 through 7 or 8, there's a lot of parity. And so coming off that Warrior series, as frustrating as it was to lose, it's easy to point to 1 or 2 variables and say, wow, if only this had gone different, if only we had been a little bit better in this spot, then we would have won the series. And I understand that. But at the end of the day, even if they had won that series, even if they had gotten past Minnesota, there's still a tier gap when it comes to legitimate championship contention. And that bar in the Western Conference for the foreseeable future is the Oklahoma City Thunder. So the more distance I get from that loss to Golden State, the more strategic I get when it comes to upgrades. And that's not to say I'm closed off. I'm certainly open. I actually think Giannis is the path that I am most inclined to pursue, because he is the type of difference maker that can elevate you a tier, perhaps in his first season with the team. But if it's not Giannis, if it's not someone that's going to dramatically change your outlook, then I'm more inclined to not entirely stay the course. There are moves around the margins you can make, but I do think Rafael Stone is justified in his argument that the Rockets, because of how this roster is constructed, they are going to be better year on year. There's going to be more improvement than most because the majority of this team is still so young. These guys should improve organically over the summer. And so you have to keep that in mind if you're looking at the trade market and potentially having to pay a premium to go out and get a win now piece. So the more I think about it and the more I look at the parity in the Western Conference from 2 through 8, yeah, you might can move a little bit closer to 2 or 3 to the top of that 2 through 8 group. But if you're still there, I'm not willing to be crazy aggressive if I think you're still a tier behind Oklahoma City, which is where I think some of these moves would happen.
Does your opinion change at all when you kind of look at, and I know you're talking about kind of the parity in the Western Conference, but one of the things that is really evident here is maybe that the Rockets, despite, and I'm not going to take anything away from them, right? They won 52 games. It was an awesome season, far exceeded expectations. But I think that maybe is part of the issue here is maybe they did overachieve a little bit relative to where their kind of median outcome maybe is for this group. For their individual talent level, and maybe some of that changes if guys do, there's internal growth and improvement, that kind of thing. But when you look at, next year, right, it'll be the Lakers' first full offseason with Luka. They're going to be able to retool around him. The Nuggets are, fresh off pushing the Thunder to 7 games, and they're still going to be one of the best teams in the West as long as they have Jokic. Maybe the Clippers fade a little bit with Kawhi and James getting older, who knows? But you also have the Spurs who are going to start making some noise in the West. You have the Mavericks who just got Cooper Flag. Like, is there any worries in your mind of, okay, well, the Rockets were the number 2 seed. They did win 52 games. But my concern, at least, is that I don't want to see this Rockets team turn into the next iteration of the Sacramento Kings, right? Where they were, the 3 seed that one year. They took the Warriors to 7 games, and then they have not reached that height since that point. Now, granted, Rockets defense that's a something that you can count on, right? It's not the flash in the pan offense that Kings team had. So I don't think they're necessarily going to just disappear next season, but I do worry that they could stagnate in what is already a brutal Western Conference.
I think it's a valid fear, but I just don't think with the assets the Rockets have that it would be that difficult to make a move at a later date for a more moderate upgrade if it turns out that you need that. I do believe that the baseline of 52 and 30 is pretty real. I don't think last year's Rockets were fluky. When you look at the underlying metrics, this is not a situation where, you get a different bounce here or there and they're maybe in the mid 40s. No, they were a 52-win team because they were legitimately a 50-plus win quality in a tough Western Conference, and they do have a young roster that should improve organically. So I don't think you need to make any panic moves. I don't expect any major regression, and the landscape of the Western Conference, it could change depending on what moves are made this offseason. We can have a different discussion a month from now for sure. But based on the state of play right now, I don't see any reason to think that they would be dramatically worse. If anything, I think they would have a more clear path to getting better because they're younger and because, as Rafael Stone pointed out, they have the types of players that are more likely to get year-on-year bumps simply based on the natural aging curve. So to answer your question, I do think it's a valid concern. I just don't think with the assets the Rockets have, and Bobby Marks of ESPN recently ranked them as 4th in the league in future draft capital, I don't think that you have to make a move now just to make one. If it turns out that next season is going a little sideways for one reason or another, I do think there's going to be other options that you can get, in December and January, all the way up to the February trade deadline that could get you similar bang for your buck. So that's why in terms of this offseason, I'm open-minded. If the right deal presents itself from a value perspective, would I do it? For sure. But first and foremost, I'm looking at the true top-of-the-line guys, the guys that would absolutely, push you a tier higher by themselves. That's where my focus is right now.
Speaking of value, how much is too much for this Houston Rockets team to consider giving up in a trade to improve the roster right now? We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. The NBA playoffs are in full swing, and every night delivers highlight-worthy performances, major momentum shifts, and can't-miss moments. Whether it's a game-winning shot or a breakout performance, there's never been a better time to get in on the action. FanDuel makes it easy to stay in the game before tip-off and live. With player props, performance trends, and same-game parlays, fans have more ways than ever to play smart and win big. Which players are showing up in the biggest moments, and how could tracking their trends help you build your next bet? Right now, you can head on over to FanDuel.com and take a look at the odds-on favorites to win the title this year in the NBA. Right now, the OKC Thunder still the overwhelming favorites at minus 460. The Pacers plus 500. The Knicks plus 2,500. And the Minnesota Timberwolves at plus 3,800 to win it all. If you're new to FanDuel, it's the perfect time to sign up. Head to FanDuel.com and place your first $5 bet. If it wins, you'll get $200 in bonus bets instantly. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, Ben, now obviously, when you start to look at, what assets the Rockets have available and what any potential trades would look like to improve this team this offseason, some of this is going to be dependent on who you're going after, right? But just in a vacuum, ignoring, what the caliber of player is, whatever, how much is I guess too much? If you're looking at this Rockets team, where is the breaking point of, okay, you shouldn't be looking at cashing in too many of the young pieces, or you shouldn't go all in too much on trade or on, future draft capital, that kind of thing? Where do you kind of draw the line as to how much this team should be looking to move on from this offseason in order to improve, if they choose to do so this offseason?
Yeah, I think there's two main criteria that I have. First, you look at the playoff rotation for next spring. And so we know it's probably going to be with Ime Udoka 8 or 9 guys. So you need to have a plan. If you're going out and making a move of any significance for the short term, which I suspect most of these trades would be, I don't think we're talking about trading for future assets. If you're the Rockets, you're going to be looking at making moves that improve your chances in the here and now. Then what do you have left to fill out your 8 or 9 man rotation? So that's something you always need to think of. If you're doing a 2 or 3 for 1 move involving 2 or 3 guys in your current rotation, it can't just be about the one guy that you're bringing in. It's also about backfilling those other 2 spots. What's your plan for that? Maybe you can use the MLE for that. Maybe if you keep the number 10 pick, that can factor in some way. There's multiple ways that you can go about it, but you do have to have a plan. If you make a move of any significance this offseason, you are inherently, I guess, making the short term more of a priority. So you do need to worry about backfilling the rotation spots. And right now, I can accept the premise that, hey, you do a 2 or 3 for 1, then maybe you have a couple of guys at the end of your bench, Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore, who can be expected and maybe should be expected to do more next year as they get to the next phase of their development. That's reasonable, but let's at least have that conversation right now. The other factor that I think you have to consider, and I've said this before, with superstar trades in the NBA, what it typically comes down to is, can you get your foot in the door? And by that, I mean, do you have enough to be desirable enough to the team trading the star, and simultaneously have enough remaining to where you're attractive to the star, to where he would want to join you? So let's use Giannis as an example, because he's the guy that I think most people are talking about right now. I think the Rockets have enough when you look at their future draft assets, most notably those 2 from the Phoenix Suns in 27 and 29. Bobby Marks has the Rockets, as mentioned, number 4 in the NBA in future draft stockpile. That's enough to tempt Milwaukee, and I do think you'd be good enough to still be a value to Giannis after a deal. That's not always going to be the case. So what I want to know, if you get someone like that, is the player good enough? And in the case of Giannis, I think it could be that it takes you to that top tier by itself. And if the player isn't at that stature, do you still have enough in reserve to make another move down the line? So that's the big question. If we're talking about someone that's not of the Giannis tier, let's look at, say, a Jaylen Brown type. I know you mentioned him lately. I don't think Jalen by himself lifts you into that Oklahoma City tier. So would I consider that? It depends on, and the contract comes into play as well, but what options do I have after the equity that I give up in this deal to then make a deal for, maybe it's Giannis, or maybe it's Devin Booker, maybe it's Donovan Mitchell, maybe it's someone we're not even thinking of. What options do I have months, even a year or 2 down the line? That's the big question I have. And it's tough to talk about abstractly because there's so many variations of these potential deals. But if it's not someone like Giannis that's potentially going to jump you a tier by himself, then do you have enough assets left in reserve to then get you that guy at a later date? To me, that's the big question.
Well, let me raise you then one further that's a little bit less abstract, right? Because you're right.
Okay.
Talking about, value and trade value is a little bit harder if you're not, pinpoint on one specific name, because there are a bunch of different contextual factors to consider. Here's one that I'm really struggling to let go of. And this is the idea that the Rockets have a very unique trade chip at their disposal for about the next month, right? And that's the team option on Fred VanVleet's contract. That team option presents a very unique opportunity for them to go chase a top level player, a star level player, without having to forego other guys on their roster, right? That's not to say they can get away with just, Fred VanVleet as the cornerstone of a star level trade, but utilizing his roughly $45 million of salary as kind of the salary ballast in any potential star trade, as opposed to having to include some combination of Dillon Brooks or Alperen Sengun or Jalen Green, who are the other three largest contracts on this Rockets team, or even factoring in other guys like Jabari Smith Jr., who has, that number 3 overall pick. So his salary is, on the upper end of the Rockets tradable salary spectrum. And at least, when I explored the idea of the Jaylen Brown trade, right, that Kevin O'Connor suggested, it was a very unique permutation where you could essentially just do Fred VanVleet and his expiring salary, which the Celtics would then be able to decline, versus, and then draft capital versus having to actually forego other key rotation guys. And so where do you stand in that department as far as potentially taking advantage of Fred's expiring deal, or the team option on his deal, I should say, versus, declining it, re-signing him, keeping him here for long term, which very much feels like the likely outcome for Fred VanVleet. But if a trade were to present itself where the team didn't want to take back any long-term salary, where Fred could be utilized as that salary filler for a star level player like a Giannis type, or like a Kevin Durant or a Jaylen Brown or whoever, how would you feel about that approach?
Potentially open to it. I think with Jaylen Brown, it would come down to what that draft equity is. Because if you're having to give up enough assets to where you don't have the stockpile to make a deal of significance in the future, if you don't have enough to get your foot in the door, then I probably wouldn't do it, because I just don't think Jaylen by himself is that caliber of player. He would make you better, but I don't think he would tear jump you. And so for me, it would come down to exactly what you would have to give up from a draft equity stockpile and what you have left in your war chest afterward. But conceptually, yeah. And I was going to talk about this more in segment 3. It's one reason why I think I'm a little bit higher on a Kevin Durant move than some in this fan base, specifically because you have the option of using Fred VanVleet. And so I know the Rockets love Fred, and, all the reports have said that they're not that interested in KD, that they love Fred. We both know there's tons of posturing this time of year. So until you get to June 29th and that option is picked up, I firmly believe that anything is on the table. And so with Durant, at his age, with only 1 year left until free agency, I do think there's a path where you could use Fred's salary as the main piece in a Durant deal. And that would potentially be a deal that upgrades you in the here and now. Fred is useful to this team. We've called him the training wheels before. Well, Kevin Durant can be training wheels too, just in a different way, but he's certainly a very good player. And there's this question of how you're going to open up more reps and opportunities on ball for Reed Shepherd anyway. That's something the Rockets have got to figure out in the next year or two. Ideally, they would do more on ball with Amen Thompson as well. So Fred is a useful piece, but I don't think he's an indispensable one. And so if you can get a better short-term piece in Kevin Durant, and you don't have to give up a ton of future draft equity, I would be open to that. Now, conceptually, could the same apply with Jaylen Brown? Maybe, but I'm wary because of Jalen's age that you might have to give up enough in that deal that you don't have enough left over in your war chest to have the optionality to do, a Devin Booker or Donovan Mitchell or someone like that down the line if you think you need it. But with someone that's a little more short-term in nature, like a Durant, I do think there's a path where you could use that FVV salary as a short-term stimulus and just supplement it with some B-level assets, and that might get a deal done for a guy that at 36 years old shouldn't have an enormous market.
So one thing that I am curious your thoughts on, right? Because this idea of obviously not using all of your assets, right, for a trade right now that doesn't jump you to that OKC tier. But for me, I think part of the equation here is how high you are on the internal talent, right? On the futures of guys like Amin Thompson, Alperen Sengun, Jalen Green, right? How much better can some of these guys get? Because I do think that if you were to make a trade that isn't necessarily a tier jumping trade, like let's say Giannis is the only trade that jumps you into the OKC tier, right? Let's say KD and Booker and Jaylen Brown, right? Guys like that. They don't necessarily jump you into OKC's tier, but they maybe solidify you as like the top end of the next tier right after OKC. Is it not possible then that like within the next year or 2 years or 3 years, right, that just based on internal growth and development, right, guys getting better across the board, all the young guys that the Rockets still have after whatever hypothetical trade we're talking about here, could that not then be the tier jump, right? Like what if Amin Thompson becomes a top 15, top 10 player in year 4 or 5 of his career, but he's not quite there, in the next year or two. I kind of view it that way, right? Where you can make a win now move. You can cash in some assets to stabilize or to guarantee yourself that 2 seed behind OKC. Basically, year in, year out, it's OKC, and then the Rockets are that very next tier right below them. And who knows, right? One key injury to OKC, maybe you line up in a conference finals and the ball bounces your way a couple more times than it probably should have. You still have like a puncher's chance. I don't think it's like you're just that far outclassed from OKC at that point. And then if you have the young guys grow and improve and get to a place where Amin Thompson is the truth, or Reed Shepherd blossoms, or whoever, maybe Cam Whitmore becomes legit, then I think that's another avenue to them kind of closing the gap between where they're at right now and where OKC is at.
It is, but I would counter with the reality, look, they won 52 games for a reason. And so if you're taking the bones of a 52-win team, and we're talking about Amin or Alpi or whoever it is taking another leap with a team that's already 52-30 and number 2 in the West, that team's going to be at the top of that next tier as is. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't look at upgrades this summer, because the scenario you presented, if those things happen and it turns out that someone like a Jaylen Brown or a KD can take you to maybe the fringe of that top OKC tier, should you consider it? Yeah, but I think it depends on the value. You don't need to do it out of desperation. And that's where I look at this from more an asset value perspective. If the deal is good enough to where it makes sense and you feel good about the liquidity, especially if it's a younger player, if you feel like he would have some liquidity himself on the trade market later on, if you think you need it, then okay. But in this scenario that you're describing where some of these young guys take leaps, you combine that with where the Rockets are already, and I feel pretty confident they're going to be in that top 4 of the West, no matter what, assuming relative health. And so you can easily make a trade later if you just save your assets and are smart. And this scenario where the young guys develop as you want, I mean, with a team that's already 52-30, that's going to be a pretty good result, whether you add a veteran of significance this offseason or you don't. So it just comes down to the value. If it makes sense and you feel like it's good, good asset return and there's some liquidity moving forward, sure. But I would just say you don't have to do it. The status quo is okay, especially if you believe that these young guys are capable of taking that next step.
Coming up, ranking the available star players this offseason for the Rockets to potentially pursue. We're going to get there in just one moment. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. All right, I could take a stab in the dark here. I'm guessing Ben is going to have Giannis ranked at number 1 on his, available. And I want to clarify really quickly. This isn't just a pure scale of the best talent available, right? This is going to factor in a couple of different things, like what it would cost the Rockets to pursue XYZ player, how they would potentially fit on the team. Because like we talked about, right, do you have enough left after said hypothetical trade in order to still be competitive? So Ben, I'm guessing you got number 1 is Giannis on your list. Explain your reasoning behind that.
Yeah, it comes down to the tier jump factor. If you can get a guy, and in this case, we're talking about a top 3 player in the world, and subtract most likely only 1, maybe 2 players of rotation significance.
What's your Giannis trade? You can't get out of here without your hypothetical Giannis trade.
That's fine, because I wouldn't do it at all costs. Yeah, there's a point where if you give up too much, then it's not worth it to trade for a 30-year-old MVP candidate if there's not a clear path to title contention in the next 3 or 4 years. So yeah, that's totally fair. But if you could give, and I'll say Amen or Sengun to leave the door open, but I think we both agree it's more likely to be Sengun. If you give up one of those guys, and I think you would have to give up one of those, otherwise you're not going to have the best offer. It's not going to appeal enough to Milwaukee. I'm sorry, it's just not for a 30-year-old MVP candidate who's still very much in his prime and just averaged like a ridiculous 30 and 12 per game. So you give up one of those guys. You give up the Phoenix draft equity. I'm guessing maybe Jabari and Cam. I mean, I would try to make it where you're not giving up more than 2 players from the rotation that we saw in the playoffs. And then you could conceivably use the MLE to, let's go back 2 years ago. We know the Rockets almost signed Brook Lopez. Giannis loves playing with Brook Lopez. Signed Brook Lopez to backfill the minutes at center. And all of a sudden, you have an upgraded rotation. Look, I love Alperen Sengun. I love Amen Thompson. But if you're ranking players for next season, they're going to come in, what, in terms of expected value? Like top 20, top 25, top 30, somewhere like that. Giannis is top 3. So as good as we feel about Alperen Sengun or Amen Thompson, and again, I'm including both of them because logically you can make the argument that Sengun has proven more at this stage than Amen has. I personally think they'd be more likely to keep Amen and trade Sengun, but you can certainly make the argument the other way. If you're going from one of those guys to Giannis, and he wants to be here, that's another part of this. It's not worth pursuing if he doesn't clearly want to be in Houston. The chemistry needs to be right. He obviously needs to want to extend with you as soon as he's eligible, which will be next offseason. I'm assuming that that's going to be the case. Otherwise, there's no reason to give up tons of draft capital and asset equity in a trade. So assuming he wants to be here and the vibe should be right and everybody's bought in on the Giannis-led Houston Rockets trying to win a title as soon as next season, I mean, you take a 52-30 team and you upgrade a top 20 to top 30 player to a top 3 player. I mean, that gets you into, 60-ish win territory, assuming relative health. Like, that's a huge jump. And to me, if you can do that without taking away significantly from your current rotation, you certainly have to give up a couple, but without having to do any like sort of crazy 3-4-for-1 type moves. I don't know. Even if it shortens your window, even if it makes the here and now way more important, it speeds up your timetable, yada, yada, you're close enough after going 52-30, number 2 in the West, that to me, it would be pretty tempting if you could get away with that.
The more that I've thought about it, right, the Giannis trade, as assuming you can get away with not, mortgaging too many of the young assets, right? And that's where you come away, like your thought process, right? One of Amen or Sengun, and then one of, the other core rotation guys. So like a Jabari or a Tari type thrown in there. And then you add Cam as like a bit of sweetener to that deal, plus the draft equity. That feels like a fair value trade. And it feels like one of the best potential offers that Milwaukee is going to potentially receive for Giannis. Very compelling points made there. Who's the second on your list as far as some of the names that are floating around out there?
Yeah, I teased to this last segment, but for me, it's Kevin Durant. And I know that's not what the Rockets are leaking. It's just when you go back to the issue of Fred VanVleet and this team option, and I agree with you, this is a unique window. I think KD is the one guy that can potentially give you an upgrade for next season that I think is attainable without really having to empty your war chest. I think from a Suns perspective, the salary relief and getting back a little of their future draft capital. You're not going to give up all of it for a 36, soon to be 37-year-old KD. I'm not crazy. But if they can get a little bit of that and a ton of salary relief and start building your team around Devin Booker, make Fred VanVleet the version of, floor-raising point guard that Chris Paul was a few years ago, that's a deal, and that's if you keep him. That's a deal that makes a lot of sense for both sides, and I think would preserve the optionality for further moves down the line. Even if KD, and I wouldn't write it off, but I don't know that KD puts you in that OKC tier by himself. but I think you could get KD without having to give up significant equity to the point where you wouldn't have other options down the line. That's why I'm looking at KD, and I know the Rockets have said they aren't, but this time of year, Jackson, it's always possible that these leaks are posturing, and it's just waiting to, for the other team to come to the table and drop their asking price.
Something like, would you do Fred, Jabari, and 2 Suns picks for KD?
If it wasn't 27 and 29, if one of the 2 picks was 25, I think I might. I wouldn't if it was the 27 and 29. To me, that's too much.
Is it weird that I almost I don't know. There's a few 3-and-D guys in this year's draft that I'm really fond of, right? Like I love Carter Bryant. I like Cedric Coward, and there's part of it where I'm thinking, man, if you had to give up Jabari in a trade to get a guy like a Giannis or a KD, I almost kind of wish that they would be able to keep that number 10 overall pick to draft another young guy to kind of grow into the rotation slowly over time. But I can understand not wanting to forego both of those future Suns picks because those are going to be the really good ones further down. Hopefully the really good ones, knock on wood.
And I would specifically love Cedric Coward because I would love to be able to yell "shoot at Coward" for the foreseeable future. But I still don't see what the path to minutes is going to be. Like, unless there's other moves that this trade is made in tandem with, you're still going to need to find more minutes for Reed Shepherd and Cam Whitmore if he's here. So in a perfect world, yeah, there's prospects that I like, but what's the path to actually getting them minutes? If it's viable, then yeah, you can make that argument. But if it's this move by itself, then I just sort of feel like you'd be kicking the can down the road in terms of this. Well, we have this interesting prospect, but how are we going to find minutes for them? And at some point, does the asset value decrease because you just can't find a way to, get them to the next phase, i.e. what the Rockets are going through with Cam Whitmore right now? To me, that's the big question here. And so to answer the question, maybe, but I just think more reasonably, I would rather the liquidity of an asset that's further in the future.
Where are you going for your third star? Assuming Giannis and KD are both unavailable, they're off the board. Where do your eyes focus on?
I mean, I think you've got to circle back to the Suns for Devin Booker. I think, it's hard for me to sort of list him on the trade target list because it's not so much an issue of whether the Rockets like him. I know there was that one report earlier this month, but I don't fully buy that they're down on Booker after one bad season. No, I think it's more, there's no reason to say you're desperate for a guy who's not even available to begin with. There's no reason to tip your hand. And so there's absolutely a world, Jackson, where some of these other rumored pursuits force the Suns this summer to think long and hard about whether they are truly willing to let those picks go to another team or whether they should just, accept reality and do what, the Nets did last summer with Mikal Bridges and trade him to the Knicks in a deal that, is more or less a 3-way deal with the Nets getting their picks back from the Rockets and the deal that sent Bridges or connected to the deal that sent Bridges to the Knicks. And so if the Suns think that the Rockets might trade one or more of their assets for some other deal, then maybe there's like a going once, going twice effect that makes them think a little bit harder about, hey, are we really willing to miss out on this window when we could get, Jalen Green and one or both of these picks right now? I still think that's viable, but it's hard to say. It's hard to say that it's within the Rockets' control. It's more just, you circle back to the Suns and see if they're willing to play ball. But yeah, I mean, I would absolutely do that. He'd be third on my list. I mean, he gives you a much more consistent version of Jalen Green. That's the bottom line. I mean, we've talked about this for 2 years now. The Rockets have a good foundation around the shooting guard position. They need that A1 scorer. Jalen has done that at times. They are still searching for the consistency now at age 23. I know Devin's a few years older, but he gives you that consistency with a team that is already 52-30, number 2 in the West. You have to be open to that scenario when you can play stylistically the same way, do so many of the things you are already doing right now, keep both of Amen Thompson and Alperen Sengun in contrast to a Giannis move. I don't know how likely it is because obviously the Suns have said time and time again that Booker's not on the table, but I don't see how you can't inquire.
Jalen Green, Dillon Brooks, number 10, and the 27-29 Suns picks. So 3 picks, Jalen and DB. Do you pull the trigger on that trade?
How much is Booker making?
I think he's making right around that same amount. I think it's like in the, or is he 40s, 50s? I'll find out really quickly. But
I thought he was in the 40s, maybe low 50s.
It is, Booker is at 49. No, I apologize. So this next season, it'll be 53. So 53
Yeah, well, the reason
trying to match.
Yeah, I think you could get there
without Devin or without Dillon.
Without Dillon, yeah, because to me, I don't know that Dillon is going to be that valuable to the Suns anyway. I think he's super valuable here in Houston, and so I would counter with, hey, can we do Jalen and the picks and not subtract Dillon Brooks? That would be the sticking point for me. If you could, I'd be open to it.
I think the Rockets would have to heavily consider that deal or any kind of permutation around that deal, because you're right. I said it earlier this month. I mean, you airdrop Devin Booker onto this Rockets team with their defense, the 52-win team that we've talked about a little bit throughout this episode, and I think they're conference finals bound pretty easily. They would have outclassed the Warriors, and I think they would have ultimately came out on top against the Timberwolves. But with that, we want your thoughts on the star players that you'd like to see this Rockets team try to go after this offseason, names that we potentially didn't mention here on the show. We want your thoughts in the YouTube comments. Ben, you know the drill. Let everybody know where to track you down at.
Yep, Ben DuBose on Blue Sky, the Rockets Wire on Twitter/X, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thanks so much for checking out the show. Remember, the best way to help us grow our show is to listen every single day on a podcast platform of your choosing, and then like, comment, subscribe on YouTube. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.